Well, folks, thanks for either coming along or tuning in to our final event for the year, and it's great to have Dr. Andrew Leigh back at the Sydney Institute after a decade or so. And he's most welcome, and we're very pleased that he can spend his time tonight talking to us on an important topic. Now, he's known to you well. I'll introduce him very briefly. Honours degrees from the University of Sydney in Arts and Law, PhD from Harvard, worked as a lawyer and in other professions, and from 2010 the member for Fraser in the ACT, which became the member for Fenner. He didn't, but the seat did, and that's called Inner Metropolitan Canberra, right? Was parliamentary secretary in the previous Labor government, but now and held senior positions in opposition, but now the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury. And tonight Dr. Leigh is going to talk on the topic, which makes it hard for someone to introduce: market power and markups, malign markers for the Australian macroeconomy. I did it. Andrew Leigh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Gerard, for your generous introduction. It is great to be back. Can I acknowledge the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Indigenous people present or watching online today. I acknowledge the Sydney Institute and its long-standing commitment to the discussion of big ideas in Australia. As Gerard said, I spoke here in 2012 on the topic of why inequality matters and what we should do about it. Returning a decade later, I'm even more convinced that inequality matters and that market power has something to do with it. Indeed, that market power is a critical part of the Australian economic story. It's hard to ignore the growing body of evidence that suggests that excessive market concentration can lead to economic problems. Dominant firms in the market might have less incentive to carry out research and development. They have less incentive to create new products. Indeed, in some cases, they may have less incentive to pay their employees fairly. As you can imagine, the drag on the economy only becomes stronger and deeper with each new concentrated market. The challenge for economists is to better understand the problems, and that means measuring them. Markups, which are the gap between production cost and selling price, are one of the most reliable indicators of the impacts of market power. Tonight I want to draw on new evidence to present analysis about what markups can tell us about competitiveness in the Australian economy. Now, concerns about market power aren't new. In fact, most people have a pretty good idea about these concepts, thanks in part to Lizzie McGee. If your 9-year-old has bankrupted you playing Monopoly, you'd be familiar with Lizzie McGee's work. McGee grew up in the aftermath of the Civil War, when the so-called robber barons controlled much of the American economy. There was an era when monopolists such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie loomed large. As the story goes, McGee's father introduced her to the ideas of economist Henry George. George sought to explain how extreme wealth could coexist with extreme poverty in 19th century America. Henry George argued that monopoly ownership of land was to blame, and he proposed a land tax to lessen landowners' ability to extract wealth from renters. George's ideas struck a chord with Lizzie McGee, and she created the landlord's game, the very first version of what became Monopoly. She designed the board game to serve as an interactive critique of market power. Her motive was clear: show players how land grabbing enriched property owners and impoverished tenants. In planting a seed for generations to come, McGee wrote, Let the children once see clearly the gross injustice of our present land system. And when they grow up, if they're allowed to develop naturally, the evil will soon be remedied. During the Great Depression and following the removal of McGee's radical overtones, the board game Monopoly became a bestseller for Parker Brothers. In fact, the Parker Brothers had to pay off McGee after she showed that her patent had been ripped off. She was paid $500, but never fully acknowledged as the game's creator. Yet another glaring inequity. Concerns about market power have been around for a while, but in the past decade, we've seen a huge increase in the number of important studies in this area. Let me catch you up on the measures and the methods, as well as some of the flaws and the findings. Concentration is the most frequent measure of market power because it only requires information on firm revenues. For example, a study that I co-authored with Adam Triggs in 2016 used IBISWorld data from a private market research firm to estimate market concentration. Market concentration tells us how much of a market the biggest players have, but it doesn't really tell you how much they're throwing their weight around. By contrast, markups, the gap between firms' production costs and what they charge their consumers, go more directly to the impact on consumers of concentrated markets. In that sense, markups are capturing the market power of firms, their ability to influence the price at which they sell their products. It's sort of easiest to see this at the extremes. If you've got thousands of companies selling a similar product, there's a going price, and that's what sellers charge. The market sets the price. At the other end of the extreme, when only one company sells a product, then they set the market price. That's the difference between market pricing and monopoly pricing. We know markups are a useful measure, but the challenge is getting the right data to measure them accurately. Ideally, economists would like to know each firm's marginal costs. Not surprisingly, most firms don't publish that information on their websites. So to get around this problem, economists have developed various ways to estimate markups. Robert Hall in 1988 was the first to propose a method using accounting data and the assumption that firms minimise their costs in order to estimate markups. From 2012 onwards, Belgian economist Jan de Locker and his co-authors extended Robert Hall's method. They show how combining estimates of production functions, the way firms produce output from labour, capital and intermediate outputs, with the cost minimisation assumption, can eventually provide us with estimates of markups. And their work has led to an explosion of research in markups across the world. There are, however, some critics of the markups research. Susanto Basu and Steve Bond and his co-authors argue that some of the startling findings on steeply rising markups are difficult to reconcile. They say for the results to be interpreted as equal to markups on prices over marginal costs, firms mustn't have market power over the inputs they use in production. For example, they point out that big firms might have the ability to influence the price they pay for labour, what Cambridge economist Joan Robinson once dubbed monopsony power. In response, de Locker and his co-authors agree that the estimates might be biased by firms' market power over input markets. However, they say that in these instances, the markups estimates are also measuring firms' market power over the factors of production that they use. Susanto Basu also argues that the rising markup story doesn't fit the fact that the 2000s and the 2010s saw a tight labour market and subdued inflation. But the problem with that critique is that there's a huge number of factors influencing employment and prices over that period. You've got a global savings glut, China's economic rise, monetary policy. So it's easy to say that perhaps prices would have been lower if markups hadn't risen. And then we look at other macroeconomic trends which support the theory of increasing markups. We've had low business investment, high and persistent corporate profits, and a decline in the labour share of income. Ultimately, despite some concerns over the data, the DeLocca method of estimating markups provides us reasonable evidence that helps explain some pretty significant patterns in the data. So now to the findings. Researchers have used the DeLocca method to estimate markups in the United States and across the world. DeLocca, Eckert and Unger found average markups in the United States increased from 21% above marginal cost in 1980 to 61% above marginal cost in 2016. The authors found that markups increased the most for high markup firms and show that this is due to increased market power. The authors also show that high markup and highly profitable firms attracted a greater share of resources, a phenomenon closely linked with so-called superstar firms. As the name suggests, superstar firms are big and dominant in their industries. David Order and his co-authors showed in 2020 that in those industries with the largest growth of market share going to superstars also saw the steepest drop in the share of income going to workers. Markups haven't just been estimated for the United States. DeLocca and Eckert estimate markups for 70,000 firms in 134 countries. They found average markups increased globally from around 10% in 1980 to 60% in 2016. Again, this is driven by firms with already high markups seeing the greatest estimated increase. And that's consistent with previous research showing greater dispersion of markups. In 2019, the International Monetary Fund also analysed approximately 900,000 firms in 27 countries and found an increase in markups from 2000 to 2015, although not quite as big as DeLocca and Eckert estimated. Global evidence supports the increase in markups being partly linked to the rise in superstar firms and suggests that an increase in markups is partly responsible for the decline in the labour share of income. The decline in the labour share worldwide appears to be driven primarily by a reallocation of resources to firms with a relatively low labour share of income. But the international results for DeLocca and Eckert should be treated with caution. Perhaps the data isn't fully representative. For example, the firms selected in Australia before 2000 tend to be quite narrow. And econometric estimates taken for the United States and applied to all firms worldwide is a relatively strong modelling assumption. So that leads me to analysis of markups in Australia and some observations in 4 significant areas. The first area is how Australia compares to other advanced economies. Groundbreaking research from Jonathan Hamburg, who's just up the road at the Reserve Bank and was formerly in Treasury, used Australian firm-level microdata to estimate markups. Taking on board one of the criticisms of the markups estimation literature, he focuses on the change in markups, not the level of markups. Jonathan's findings suggest industry average markups increased about 6% from 2003 to 2016. Interestingly, firms in the top 10% of the distribution of markups are the ones with the biggest market share. However, unlike in the United States, there's no evidence of reallocation of resources towards high markup firms. The second area of interest is technology. Changing technology might explain higher firm concentration and higher markups. Software and digital technologies often have increasing returns to scale, meaning outputs grow faster than inputs. That inherently offers bigger benefits to bigger firms. And that's particularly true for digital firms that have low marginal costs and operate in markets with strong network effects. Between 2003 and 2016, markups for the most digitally intensive Australian firms rose 12%, compared to 4% for other firms. These results suggest that changing technology played a role in increasing markups. It also shows that markups have increased for the less digitally intensive firms. So there must be other dynamics, like an increase in market power, that are important. The third observation is how the findings on markups relate to the broader challenges facing the Australian economy. The evidence from markups aligns with other evidence suggesting competitive pressure in the Australian economy has declined. The period from 2005, 2009 to 2010 to 19 saw a decline in market dynamism across a host of measures. Firm entry and exit rates have declined. Australia is not growing as many small businesses as we used to. There's a lower share of employees working at young firms. Job mobility has declined, which matters because the biggest pay rises people get over the course of their career tend to be when they switch jobs. And at the same time, the largest firms have increased their market share. One of the measures we use is the Herfindahl Index of Market Concentration, which has gone up substantially over this period. Declining dynamism in the product and the labour markets have occurred simultaneously. And there's even some evidence of a correlation across sectors. For example, if you look at where job mobility rates have dropped more, that's in sectors where the share of young firms has seen the greatest declines. Industries with less young firms are also industries with less job switching, with all the productivity and earnings benefits it brings. And what about when it comes to market concentration and markups? When I plot industry-level changes in concentration against industry-level changes in markups, I can see an upward slope. So from 2003 to 2016, the industries that saw the greatest consistent annual increase in concentration also saw bigger increases in markups. And the fitted line is statistically significant at the 10% level. So it provides not absolutely conclusive evidence, but pretty suggestive evidence of a link between the growth in markups and the growth in market concentration. That's consistent with findings from the new think tank E61, which suggests that more dynamic markets would benefit workers. That's partly because of higher rates of new firm creation and labour mobility, raise the value of workers' outside options. So like other advanced nations, markups in Australia have increased since the turn of the century. Australia's most digitally intensive industries increased markups the most. Australian industries with the greatest increase in concentration also recorded the greatest increase in markups. And before I wrap up, I want to acknowledge the Treasury officials for both the research drawn on in this presentation and more broadly. Treasury's published papers on Australia's productivity challenges in the latest edition of the department's in-house journal, Economic Roundup. The work by Zach Doretto, Omar Majid, Jonathan Hamburg, Iris Day and Patrick Hartigan draws impressively on the data crunching prowess of the Australian Treasury. Outside central banks, it's actually pretty unusual to have a government agency producing so much cutting-edge research. And that's a credit in turn to Stephen Kennedy, the Treasury Secretary, and his willingness to invest in the infrastructure and personnel that have led this work in such a critical area. So studying markups can tell us a lot about the competitiveness of the Australian economy. They can tell us about the way in which market dynamism correlates across product and labour markets, and the way in which concentration and markups go together. The challenge is big, but I'm actually pretty optimistic about the path ahead. There's no straightforward solution. It's not like when you're playing Lizzie McGee's Monopoly and you can suddenly get a get out of jail free card. It's not like getting a chance card that lets you advance to go and collect $200. But Australia does have a chance to boost productivity, which is the key to increasing living standards in the long run. It's terrific to see a renewed focus on productivity from people across the community, from policymakers to researchers to business leaders. The Jobs and Skills Summit sparked many of these conversations, and productivity and wages will feature in the employment white paper to follow. The ACCC's new digital platform services inquiry focused on the way in which competition reforms could boost productivity in that critical sector. And in the meantime, I welcome debate on markups, the Malign markers for the Australian macroeconomy. And I look forward to returning to the Sydney Institute in a decade's time to discuss the more dynamic and more competitive Australian economy of 2032. Thanks very much.
Well, many thanks to Dr. Leigh for a well-researched and very thoughtful paper. You're coming back in a decade just because he's a very well-known marathon runner of enormous success, as I understand it. So you're thinking of the long term, but we think more of the sort of 5,000 metres, so we hope to have you here before the next election. Okay. So you started off, I mean, it's a very challenging paper, but let's go back to where you started off with inequality. You've been looking at markups, you've been looking at that side of it. To what extent has the problem of inequality been handled to some degree by increasing in welfare payments, other kind of payments, in particular the NDIS? I mean, is that making a difference to inequality, or is the issue much more substantial than that? Maybe just come back and talk to the room.
Thanks, Gerard. Certainly Australian inequality would be a lot bigger if it wasn't for our tax and transfer system. My read of the evidence is that the redistributive impact of taxes has decreased a little over the last couple of decades. I haven't seen good work on transfers, but as you say, the NDIS is going to be a key part of creating a more equal society. But that's pushing against a labour market where the dispersion of wages is going up. So the wage growth at the 10th percentile over the course of the last generation is about a third of what it is at the 90th percentile. So the question in terms of post-tax, post-transfer inequality is, have we seen an increase in redistribution that matches the increase in market inequality? And my sense is no. If we look at the post-tax outcomes, they're more unequal than they were. And that's, I'm thinking about income inequality, but of course the huge increase in house prices also drives wealth inequality really substantially. The gap between those who were in the property market 2 decades ago and those who are yet to get a foothold on the ladder means that wealth inequality has grown pretty substantially too.
And to what extent is that, I mean, because as you know, you can have a lot of wealth without having much income.
Yes, absolutely. So
how does that work itself out?
Well, it's obviously people, high assets, low income. Think of a pensioner living in a house where the mortgage has been fully paid, and people the other way around. Somebody who's just gotten a foot on the ladder, working as a coder in a tech company, pulling in a lot of income but not a lot of assets yet. But the two correlate pretty highly. So you, in general, those who have a higher stream of income coming in a given year are also those who have bigger bank balances and more assets to their name.
Andrew, when you talk about concentration of market power, I've got to say that my mind immediately goes to the big banks. Labor's always seen itself as the defender of the vulnerable. But what we're seeing at the moment with the closure of banks in regional and suburban areas is very devastating to at least a big section of our population. it may not be the market share that you were talking about, but the decline in services seems to me a part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. I was on the House Economics Committee in the last term, and so we had a chance to quiz the big four bank CEOs. And one of the questions I made a point of asking each of them is, how many ATMs do you have, and how many branches do you have, and which have you closed? We were doing these hearings through the COVID crisis, and they were closing branches left, right, and centre. And their comment was, well, our branches tend to be much emptier than they were. More people are doing business online. For most activities, you can do it online. But if you're someone who's uncomfortable with working online, either lack of tech literacy or simply not having access to a good solid internet connection, then effectively you're being debanked by that. And then there's things that they still do demand you to come in and do online. So I've got 3 little boys. They've got bank accounts. You want to put both parents on those bank accounts. You've got to go in person and sit in the branch while they work through all the details and the paperwork and so on. And that's fine for us because we've got a branch which is 5 minutes drive away from our house and we've got a car. But if the nearest branch is an hour's bus trip away, then that really does create an inequity for access to banking services. Someone in those circumstances might well say to the kids, sorry, it's just too much of a pain to give you your own bank account. So it's a real issue.
Thanks very much, Dr. Leigh. That's a very interesting analysis that you've talked about in terms of markups. My question is, are you just looking at industries where the firms are selling goods, or are you also looking at services? And how do you work out the markups in industries that are selling services rather than goods?
So it's both goods and services, although as you rightly discern, Bob Hall's method is pioneered thinking about, the canonical example is a US manufacturing firm. And as you move more to a services economy, then the assumptions become stronger. So if we're thinking about a consulting firm, for example, or if you're thinking about the Sydney Institute, then the inputs, measuring the value of the inputs for the Sydney Institute and thinking about how that markup works is more complicated than it would be for a standard manufacturing firm. But those problems should affect the data equally from the 2000 to 2016, which is the period where Jonathan Hamble was looking. So that shouldn't be driving the change. This is part of the reason why people have moved away from saying the markup went from 10% to 20% and instead saying the markup increased by 6%. We're less confident that we know what the markup is at any given time. We're more confident we can see a change in the markups over time.
Thank you, Dr. Leigh. Given the ACCC's recent announcement of investigating how airfares are priced, I spoke recently at a Australian inquiry as a Swissport baggage handler and union delegate in Sydney for Qantas that were constantly short-staffed, leading to us being unable to fulfil supply for demand in flights. Do you currently see other reasons, particularly regarding a lack of airline competition for extremely high airfares?
So thanks, Cameron. It is one of the other industries people go to. So it's we immediately think through in our minds what are the least competitive industries in Australia, and the examples that most people jump to: supermarkets, banks, airlines, telcos. I should say there's a lot of other industries that have competition problems: concrete, banking, baby food, beer. Industries you wouldn't necessarily think about when you first think of market concentration. But in the area of airlines, it's certainly a challenge. And when the new entrant Bonza tells us that it won't be flying out of Sydney because it can't get landing slots, then you've got to raise at least one eyebrow about what's going on in the market. It would be great it will be good for airline competition to have Bonza enter the market. It's always useful to have a new competitor come in, particularly in a stage where the discounting for the cheapest fares seems to have gone down. So when I read this latest ACCC report, it's noting that prices are high, not so much because the people sitting at the front of the plane are paying more, but because people sitting at the back of the plane aren't getting a discount. And that might well mean that there's a set of people who would like to go and see a relative interstate who just can't afford to make the trip. So it's not just that there's redistribution from a corporate flyer's bottom line into the airline's bottom line, it's that someone's missing out on a flight. That worries me, and that's why it's important to get discount airlines in, and it's why it'd be really nice if the new discount airline was able to find a way in to fly out of the busiest airport in the country. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. That question more or less overtook mine, but I'm interested in how you change the way we live in large cities and large Western societies, because so much of where we shop is now really chains of large corporations. The sports girl shop or the hardware shop or even maybe the petrol shop are all part of a big chain. And they look like you might think your local whatever shop is a small business, but in fact it's a franchise. So what do we do? Because it's what we like. We go to our big shopping areas, we like to have things online quickly and easily. How do you change that culture, and how do you make it easier for people running small businesses to be part of the competition?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think about that scene from one of the Shrek movies where Shrek's walking down the monster's walking down the street and crunches a foot down on top of a Starbucks store, and everyone sprints out of the Starbucks store and across the street into the other Starbucks store on the other side of the road. And it just epitomises the way in which that coffee chain has completely taken over America. And the reason it hasn't in Australia is partly that we've got more of a culture of small coffee shops, but also might be something to do with the competitive dynamism of the Australian economy and the fact that there has been a niche for those small firms. But independent hardware has almost entirely been squeezed out by large chains now, and it's getting tough for areas like independent liquor retailing. So you need to make sure that that the ACCC has the powers it needs to do good analysis and good reviews, that it has access to all of the data that's appropriate. And if you look in the area of petrol pricing, the big data analysis really is important in understanding whether there's so-called tacit collusion going on. And in the area of hardware competition, it has to do with really going in and understanding the markets and working out what's going on if a Bunnings happens to set up across the road from the last Mitre 10 in town, as I'm told is happening in some parts of Australia. We want to make sure that those small businesses are thriving, not just on a business model of let me start a small business in the hope that I'll be bought by a big business, but actually thriving on the notion that they have a chance of taking on the others. And it goes even to issues like tax. You know, what we're doing on multinational tax avoidance, trying to close those loopholes, is about creating a level playing field and a more competitive business environment.
Yeah, I just want to say the other area is pharmacies.
Yes.
It's very, very hard for small pharmacies now to compete with big ones.
A surprisingly concentrated area. So, yes, making sure that in areas where you've got franchises, that you've got appropriate competition across the stores.
Hi, Andrew. From the data I've seen, it appears that the increases in markups you're talking about are really fueling executive salaries and company profits and throwing out the balance between productivity, workers' wages, and profits that has existed for a long time. And so, if that's the case, what options does the government have available to kind of restore something a little bit more sane in terms of the balance between productivity, wages, and profits?
Yeah, so I've been talking a lot about the drivers of productivity, which in the long run is the key driver of living standards. When this building was built, I assume this is a turn of the century kind of building, Anne?
It's about 1860.
Last century.
Yes, okay, 1860. So workers today are earning about 10 times in real terms what workers would have earned at the time when this building was built, and that's almost entirely productivity. But then there's periods, as you know, Chris, where suddenly productivity gets out of whack with wages, where workers aren't getting their share of productivity gains. And the last decade has been the lousiest decade of productivity growth in the post-war period, but it's also been a period where, even given that lousy productivity growth, average employees haven't gotten their fair share. So one of the things we're aiming to do with the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill was to rebalance that, to ensure that there was a little more bargaining power available for employees and they were able to get their fair share of productivity gains. Long run, I think that's strongly in business interests. Wise businesses recognise that if they want well-paid consumers, then people need to pay their workers well. It's only short-sighted firms that somehow think they can have the magic of highly paid consumers and lowly paid workers.
Do you think that's not a prisoner's dilemma sort of situation?
And that's why you need public policy. Yes. So you can't, I mean, occasionally you get a Henry Ford who says, I'm going to unilaterally raise the wages of my workers so they can afford to buy my cars. But it's not through the beneficence of the Henry Fords that you're going to see long-term wage gains.
Okay, so can I ask you about Australia compared with the OECD? I mean, I've got some of the key, the similar nations in the OECD. Have we got a greater problem with inequality, a lesser problem with inequality?
So inequality in Australia would place us in about the top third of the OECD. We're not as unequal as the United States, but we're significantly more unequal than Scandinavian countries or the typical continental European country. Inequality's grown across most English-speaking countries faster than it has across non-English-speaking countries. And one of the theories for this is that in those countries there's been a common labour market for highly skilled talent in which wage rises at the top in the United States flow through to wage rises in Canada, UK, US, New Zealand, Australia. So you see New Zealand and Australian inequality sitting pretty closely in lockstep, in part because it's a common labour market.
No.
Hi, Dr. Andrews. Can you hear me? Okay. In Australia, we're a modest-sized population, 25 or 26 million, large landmass. And if you go through some of the industries that you mentioned, the big four banks have about 81% market share. We've got two supermarket chains that control about 75% of the supermarkets. We've got concentration in the media sector, etc., etc., etc. So unless you take a very radical policy and try and get those companies to divest their assets, which I don't think you would recommend, how do you try and bring some more competition into those highly concentrated industries?
Yes, it's a great question. You spent all this time, Andrew, talking about the problem. What on earth are you going to do about it? You are, after all, a member of government, so stop telling us about the problem and tell us what you're going to do. We passed a couple of reforms already. We increased the penalties for breaches of anti-competition law, which brings them into line with other advanced countries. So taking the maximum penalty from $10 million per breach to $50 million a breach. We've banned unfair contract terms, which are terms that, for example, allow the more powerful party to unilaterally cancel the contract or unilaterally raise the price. We're consulting now on the ACCC's Digital Platform Services inquiry. It's got a proposal to prohibit unfair trading practices, which would be a sort of broad-based prohibition that tries to go to some of the harms that have led to the proliferation of industry-specific codes. So you would have noticed that over the course of the last decade, there's a code for this industry and a code for that industry. One of the suggestions being made is that many of those codes really go to the harm of an unfair trading practice. So why not prohibit that overall? And then they're suggesting that there should be specific platform-specific regulation. So there you might say, well, Google's 95% of the search market. If you want to advertise for people who are searching, really Google is the entire game. So you need platform-specific regulation to say that Google can't self-preference its own products in providing ads. And there you would say that you're going to have a set of regulations that apply to Google, but not to DuckDuckGo. Does anyone use DuckDuckGo, by the way? There you go. Okay, we've got 3 people in the room, which is higher than the average share across the population. I think it's 1% of the Australian population uses DuckDuckGo. So the rationale would be that the 95% search engine is subject to a regime which other search engines aren't subject to. And then you take that approach and think about how that applies to Apple's App Store, to Facebook and the like. So that's a proposal from the ACCC. We're consulting on it now.
Dr. Leigh, you talked about inequality. We're hearing a lot about energy inequality, and now we're hearing murmurs of, let's now nationalise energy companies. We're seeing what Victoria is proposing with its State Electricity Commission. I think that's the term. But is this the next stage in bringing about equality within energy supply?
No, I don't think anyone's at the federal level talking about nationalising energy companies, but there is a desire to make sure that this short-term international shock doesn't have really nasty repercussions for the Australian economy. So if you're operating a factory, you've got a niche in advanced manufacturing in Australia, you've been doing well for decades, it seems pretty unreasonable that a war in Ukraine should cause an energy price spike that puts you out of business. So in terms of maintaining effective, productive firms in the Australian economy, we do need some kind of a solution that is what National Capital will be looking at on Friday. Now, I was speaking to a big manufacturer on Monday night, and they were saying, well, we're fine at the moment because we've got our energy locked in on a 2-year contract. But the bloke said to me, we feel a little bit like those households that locked in for a low fixed rate mortgage during the COVID period. We know it's coming to an end, and we know when it comes to an end, the market price is way higher than what our contract's locked in on. And there's a bunch of manufacturers sitting in those circumstances. So I think it's reasonable that we turn to gas and coal companies making record profits and ask them and the state and territory governments to step up and find a solution that looks after Australian households and preserves our manufacturing base.
Yeah, Dr. Leigh, Stephen Walters from the Business Council. You mentioned a few times during your speech about economic dynamism and how that's been dwindling and maybe undermining productivity. And I know Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute spoke about this at the Jobs and Skills Summit that you also mentioned. I think she described Australia as becoming older, fatter and slower, which I thought was a colourful way of describing that. But some of the symptoms you mentioned about low labour mobility, fewer startups, fewer business failures, frankly, as well, that the old firms are sort of prevailing and the capital's getting stuck in maybe unproductive businesses. Another question about what you're going to do about it as the government of the day, like what are you going to do to get productivity lifted and how are you going to get dynamism to come back? Because I think the two are really closely linked.
Yeah, Stephen, it's a critical issue both for the BCA and the government, and I think we've had a whole lot of productive dialogues there about ways in which we can boost productivity. I've talked about the competition piece, but I also see this as being about investing in individuals and investing in infrastructure. Investing in individuals means having a training system where our schools are working better, given that we know that Year 9 kids now score about as well on the OECD's PISA tests as our Year 8s did at the turn of the century, and improving the number of people who are getting high-quality post-school qualifications. And then the infrastructure piece is about building the infrastructure where we need it. We've got the 3rd lowest population density in the world. Our ability to build roads to nowhere is second to none. If we build roads based on pork barrelling, we'll make disastrous mistakes that'll hurt productivity. We've got to make sure those road and rail and port and infrastructure is going exactly where the economy needs it. Otherwise, we're not going to get the productivity gains, which means we're not going to get the living standards increases. So whether your priority is bigger corporate profits, higher wages, more generosity to foreigners, more nicer bathrooms for Australia, you should be in favour of productivity growth.
So, yes?
Can I just follow up on my question about franchises, whatever? There is a problem for small business competition, whatever. We've become so used to being able to have a huge array of choice, so that it's rather hard for a small hardware shop to match Bunnings. It's very hard for a small pharmacy to match Priceline. And that goes right across the board. So it really isn't the fault necessarily of the market, it's the fault of us, the consumer. What do you do there?
Yeah, it's interesting though, and I mean, there's industries where small has been sustainable. So you think about medical practices where people quite like their ability to see their own doctor. Not many people say, well, what I'd love is to go to a medical practice which has as many doctors as possible. Hairdressing salons, you value the connection with the person that cuts your hair. Often with law firms, you'll have small law firms that are able to exist strongly because people value the fact that they get to see the same lawyer. So in a services economy, I guess it's partly about the products that are being sold, but partly also about the service that comes with them. And when I talk to people in Metcash about what the value proposition is for small independent hardware stores, they talk about the value of being able to see somebody that understands your project, that remembers what you were engaged with last time, that can help out with the local trades, get things in locally, and be a sort of collaborator for the business rather than simply a faceless retailer. It's a hard niche to occupy, but that's where those independent hardware stores see themselves, and I think it's probably also the way in which many other small businesses try to occupy an effective niche.
There's a question.
Hi, I've got a second
Speak
question.
up a bit.
I've got a second question.
Yeah, speak up.
I got a second question. About a year ago, so before you were in government, there was a transaction that caught my eye. I'm just curious if you'd like to comment on it. Not that it's relevant because the transaction's been done, but ME Bank, which was a not-for-profit bank owned by a number of industry funds, was acquired by ANZ. What did you think of that transaction with hindsight?
Yeah, look, I don't have any I honestly don't know enough about the ME Bank ANZ transaction. What I do think is we need to do a better job of doing post-merger reviews and assessing post 5 or 10 years on, what were the claims that were being made by the merging parties and how well have those claims been realised? Because I know there's a significant economic body of research that suggests that in general, mergers don't tend to realise the same economic gains that their proponents are advocating. And it's a bit like a footy tipper who doesn't bother looking at the results and going back and seeing which games they tipped right and which games they tipped wrong. If you're a merger review authority and you're not doing post-merger reviews, you're not building the sort of feedback loops that will allow you to make better decisions the next time. And ideally ask the question, well, of course our crystal ball isn't perfect, but how do we improve it?
Question down here.
Thanks, Andrew. What do you see as the relationship between innovation and markup? So is the higher markup a reward for innovation, which is what we're encouraging? And so when we look at markets, say we look at an iPhone, do we say, well, they created this market, they now have concentration, and the reason they've got the higher markup is reward for the innovation?
Yeah, I think the markups can, in some of those digitally intensive industries, occur because the firm is providing something no one else has. That can occasionally be a better product. Sometimes it can just be a bigger network. So if I created a new social network tomorrow and asked you to join me on it, you'd probably say, well, that's terrific. Yeah, you and I get to communicate on a social network. How good is that? Of course, if you're on a social network, you want to engage with other people, and lots of these industries have network externalities. But then you look at industries which are not characterised by the sort of new iPhone model, but where firms seem to be producing something that smells an awful lot like it hasn't really changed over time, and yet you see the markups rising. So that's I think most of the story, rather than a story about each of these markups being a case of the market rewarding clever innovation.
Actually, that was a fairly similar question to the one that I'm about to ask, actually. I'm in a small business. I've come up with a widget that people seem to like. I can get $50 for it, and I can get $70 for it. Why shouldn't I get $70 if everyone wants to pay $70? Now, that's a markup. You're saying that marking it up like that is not a good thing? If my business can get a little bit more money, I can afford to pay my staff a little bit more, and so on. So why is it such a bad thing to have markup?
So markups aren't evil in themselves, but an increase in markups does suggest the muting of competitive pressures. So in an economy, say your widget is patent protected, we should expect to see you earn higher profits for 20 years, and then for other firms to come in and produce a similar widget at $50, matching your production costs, rather than at $70, which is what you could charge as a monopolist. But if there's somehow an ability for you to keep competitors out, to build what economists call moats around your product, to evergreen your patents, then we're going to see those markups persisting for longer. There will be a markup when a patent-protected monopolist produces a new product. But why that markup should be persistently higher now than it was 2 decades ago, that's the puzzle we're getting at.
Second last question here.
Thanks. Sir Andrew, any friend of Michael Kirby's is almost, albeit our politics, because Michael has none, and looking upon us above the fireplace here at the Sydney Institute is a friend of mine.
Okay.
My question, I know Gerard wants us to be short. My question is quite simple. Would you refresh our minds as to the direction and power of the Minister vis-a-vis Gina Cascolt-Leigh, who is also an associate of Michael's, to investigate any issue of the ACCC? And finally, should politics, parties, be investigated?
So, Jeremy, there's been some good recent work in the United States that argues that the real problem with American politics is a lack of competition and the difficulty of start-up political party. This isn't my expertise, but I do note that in Australia, start-ups in federal politics seem to have done remarkably well at the last election. So I wouldn't see that as being a major problem here. The balance with the ACCC and myself is something I think it works quite well. So the head of the ACCC not only has statutory independence in terms of not being able to be dismissed and having powers to make independent decisions, but also has a tradition of policy innovation. So you've seen this with a whole series of successive ACCC chairs. Alan Fells and Rod Sims, I think, have pushed the envelope most, of being out there and saying, here's the problem in the economy and this is what government ought to do about it. Sometimes that's a bit uncomfortable for governments, but where you've got a good regulator seeing all the data coming in, I actually think it's really useful for the economy to have that ability of the independent competition watchdog, not just to say, here's how we're going to crack down using today's laws, but here's what we think the laws should be tomorrow.
Finally, we know that being in the Ministry of Treasury and Competition's a pretty busy job, but what's going on in charities? What's all that about?
Excellent. So I've had the charities portfolio since 2013 when Labor went into opposition, and am thinking about the portfolio not just as a charity regulation portfolio, but as a community building portfolio. The last generation has seen a decline in the share of Australians joining community groups, playing team sport, a drop in the share of people volunteering. We've got a decline in the share of Australians who know their neighbours' names, and a halving in the average number of friendships that the typical Australian has. So I'm trying to work with charities, not-for-profits and philanthropists to think about how we can build an Australia that is reconnected, in which people have more friends, know more neighbours, are more likely to join community groups. And in some sense, tonight's gathering represents the best of that. You're here in person, engaging not only with me, but hopefully with one another. Hopefully you'll meet somebody new before you leave the room, and in so doing, build the social capital in Australia and help to turn the challenge around. The challenge of rebuilding community is a fun one because it's not just a task for government. It's a task for community organisations, and it's a task for all of us as individuals. And one final plug, if you've got a street which is amenable to street drinks, it isn't too late to organise Christmas drinks for your street. My wife and I are reasonably busy, but we do it every year for our street. It is terrific fun. We like our neighbours, but even if we didn't like our neighbours, it would be worth organising street Christmas drinks, because for the price of an hour and a half of our time, we build stronger social capital on the street and make it a safer and happier place to live. Thanks very much for having me.
For our Canberra members and viewers on Zoom, give us a note. I'll send you the Minister's address. I'm sure he'll welcome you, making friends. Look, many thanks to Dr. Leigh for a terrific speech tonight. Very well researched, very thoughtful. I think we were going to be number 2 on the list of competition, but we had to postpone this because of the Queen's death and the reschedule in Federal Parliament, so we ended up number 4. But I'm glad we ended up number 4. I think it's a great way to end the year. We're very grateful to you, and you must come back before the next election. Thank you.